Hello everyone, my name is John Patrick, but I'm a retired professor of biochemistry and pediatrics who retired a little early because students started pushing me on my cynicism about the Department of Education, and I realized that what I needed to do was talk to them about a better story than the one the Department of Education produces. And once I started doing it, one thing led to another, and I ended up leaving the university a year or two early and starting another career, age 60, and it's now 2025, so I'm still going. I'm 85. I wake up every morning and say, good Lord, what's happening? Thank you. So last week, I was working my way through the 9 questions, and I reached an hour, and I'd only got through 6, so I stopped at that point, but I'll finish off the other 3 now. For those of you who are listening perhaps for the first time, or you missed that episode, the ancient world knew that there were questions that everybody needed to answer in order to flourish. And they are, where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? That's the first sort of, if you like, basic questions. And then the next 3 are the same questions, but attached to very specific aspects of human life. How do I make sense of death, particularly my own? How do I come to terms with suffering? And how can I believe in justice in an unjust world? Those questions have been around for a long while. And we dealt with those to a degree, enough to get you going, some things to read. The last 3 are the university problems, and they're really screwing up badly when it comes to this. And they are, what can I know? Therefore, what should I believe? Therefore, what should I do? Knowledge, belief, and ethics, in other words. Now, we have really had some trouble over my lifetime with the first of the few, what can I know? The problem has been the success of reductive science, experimental science, which treats everything as a problem that can be dealt with by measuring. And it's been incredibly powerful for the development of science. And when that science was applied more effectively in the area of finance, then world wealth began to increase without us actually knowing how it was done in many ways. But it's a reduced understanding of the world. It doesn't deal with injustice, suffering, and death, that reductionistic approach. So we need to know more than can be taught by science. We saw that very clearly with COVID. The people running it were reductionists of the worst variety without even understanding what had happened to them. And then they lied to boot. So it was an utter disaster. Whereas the people who were doing good quality epidemiology, where you have to deal with what people actually do, they actually knew what the right way to go was. You should get all people out of warehousing and into homes where they could isolate themselves, which is the best thing that the elderly can do in that setting. The vaccine proved not to be anywhere near as effective as it should have been, and if it had been put through the proper trials to begin with, we wouldn't have claimed that it could do as much as we claimed it could do, and it couldn't. So it was a classic example of where people who dealt with people on an everyday basis and talked to them as human beings knew what should be done. Step 1 is to isolate the most vulnerable people. And what you certainly shouldn't do is try and isolate children and make them wear masks for 2 years. Children are meant to have lots of infections. They're firing up their immune system for life. It's not an accident that I've never seen a case of inflammatory bowel disease in Africa or indeed in the tropics. Why? Well, we don't know for certain, but it's got a lot to do with the fact that 2-year-olds in the tropics crawl around in the mud and the dirt a lot more than they do here. We have evidence that kids who grow up on a farm, who inevitably crawl around not only in the dirt, but in the excreta of the animals on the farm in various forms, they have much less inflammatory bowel disease than the rest of the population. And they don't have shorter lives, if anything, they have longer lives. That's the way it works. I mean, the most hilarious version of this phenomenon is found in the koala bear, who lives entirely on eucalyptus leaves. But from an evolutionary point of view, that's problematic because they don't have the enzyme in their guts to break down eucalyptus leaves. So how do they survive? Well, they have the most giant appendices full of bacteria which do have the enzyme to break down eucalyptus leaves. So the actual step of breaking down the leaves into things that the koala bear can absorb is, if you like, rented out to the local microbiology. And there has been some adjustment because when mum has a koala bear, she also has an unfortunate, or actually very fortunate, episode of very watery diarrhea for 2 or 3 weeks. And the cub sucks it up and thereby gets the bugs that it needs to get its appendix going properly so that it can be a koala bear and live on eucalyptus leaves. We're probably suffering from hyper-hygienicness. You could eat your breakfast off the floor of most American homes. They are so clean. And certainly nothing of nastiness is there in most cases. Now, a real bug in the wrong place at the wrong time, that's bad news. So, the epidemiologists who cared about people and their interaction with environment and disease said, no, what we should do is get the old people out of places where they're warehoused in large numbers so that they can isolate in very small numbers and decide who they will see and who they will not. We need to carry on with children as normal so that they can continue their mental development, which, of course, we're now going to have for the next 70 years. A group of people going through have been denied the proper psychological and educational development for 2 years at a critical period. I've seen estimates that they've already lost 10% of their lifetime GDP. That's really very sad. And we've also damaged trust in the medical system because of the problems, which we're still not facing completely. There must be some data out there. I hope somebody will send it to me. But there's got to be a quality analysis of COVID, and I haven't seen one. That's quality-adjusted life years difference that a treatment makes. Now, the vaccine may have extended the life of people in their 70s and 80s who only have a few years to go anyway. So you can't have a huge quality number there. But we're already seeing that there are definite excess deaths in 20-year-olds, especially males, from myocarditis. And the new mRNA vaccine turns up not just in the injection site as it used to, but in the brain, the reproductive organs, the heart, the kidneys. What does that mean in the long run? We don't know. At least I haven't seen any good explanations. Now, I'm delighted to see that Jay Bhattacharya, who was one of the 3 epidemiologists who got cancelled for telling the truth, is now head of NIH, the biggest funder of medical research in the world. And if you haven't listened to it, he has a wonderful interview about what he hopes to achieve. To me, they sound absolutely right. I might talk about them at some point. I'd love to talk to him, but he's far too busy. But listen to him being interviewed by Peter Robinson, who he's known for years at Stanford. So the idea that what we can know can only be described by science is utter and complete nonsense. When you say you know exactly what your grandmother or grandfather would do in certain situations, that's got no scientific basis to it. Nothing has been measured. That's life experience. That's why children and all of us throughout our lives love narratives which bring an area of knowledge to the fore in a way that nothing else can do. The trouble is our narratives are getting dumbed down by AI and by rather nasty media processes which addict us to trivia, which destroy our concentration span, etc. But more of that in a bit. But we need narrative. A lovely example of how that works, how it can fill in a hole for people. Some years ago, well over 25, I think, something of that order, probably 20 years. I can't remember exactly. I must ask Victor when I see him next. But we brought a refugee from the Rwanda war to Canada, and he lived with us for 5 years while he learned English and got a law degree. He now works for the federal government. A lovely guy, and we much enjoyed having him as part of our family. But it was very interesting. If we went out and he was left in the house, by this time we actually had, since all our children had grown up, a television, a means of playing videos. I forget which version, the very old-fashioned thing. But when we came back, he would more often than not be watching a BBC series. And the one that he watched on tape was Pride and Prejudice, that brilliant 6-part version. Now, why would a young man from Central Africa find that Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice really spoke to his soul? But it did. And of course, the reason wasn't far to go. I mean, Jane Austen is writing about a group of people who live very mannered lives. In other words, how you ought to behave was really quite strictly understood. It wasn't controlled by laws or bureaucrats telling you what to do. It was produced by the way the local society behaved, and societies can impose on one another, and that's what they do. Now, Rwanda was like that. In Central Africa was like that. There were the way you should behave in certain circumstances was very rigorously known to one another. It wasn't enforced in any way. It was simply known. So coming here, it looked to him as though it was almost anarchy. People did what they wanted to do. The sense of how they ought to believe was much less than he expected, and it was upsetting for him because, of course, it makes it difficult to negotiate life as a stranger when you don't have a shared set of, I don't like the word values, norms, behaviors that are expected. And he could see that in 18th century Britain as described by Jane Austen. So Jane Austen was immediately accessible to him. And what's happening in that story? Well, I mean, it starts with the reductive factor. A single man with a good fortune must be in need of a wife, the famous opening lines. And 6 hours of television can get you to the point where Darcy says to Elizabeth, you must have thought me devoid of all proper sentiment when you first met me, when they've learned that they are made for one another and they are in love. Proper sentiment. That's fascinating, isn't it? Not your sentiment, but proper sentiment. Something that refers to what everybody knows, what you ought to do. And we are a society that's trying to live as though we make up our own oughts. It can't work. You need to think about that a lot. I mean, when God had allowed his creature to screw up 2 or 3 times on the way, after a few millennia, so to speak, they were finally given a codified law. And that law begins with a very important phrase. And when I ask most people what precedes the first thou shalt not, in both Deuteronomy and Exodus, Deuteronomy 5, Exodus 20, they don't know. Some do, but most don't. It's this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Could they get out of Egypt on their own? No, they were a slave society. There was no way they were going to get out of Egypt. and go through the desert on their own. But their experience was that God did that. And that story is all that God does. He doesn't give any rationale for the laws he's giving, except that he says, if you will keep these laws, what I like to call the 10 divine intolerances, just to rub the liberal nose in the dirt, you will flourish. And if you don't, you won't. That's an astonishing thing to say, but of course it's true. Now, the next thing I hope to get round to when I finish this bit is to begin to talk about reading. And the Jews were very unusual. Reading, as we'll talk about later, has been a very minority activity, except a few times. But then, even then, in Egypt and in China and in the Fertile Crescent, it was practicalities that drove the desire to read. But for the Jews, it was the fact that Torah needed to be learned. And so they read for non-scientific reasons, for cultural reasons. That they didn't see it that way, but primarily because God said, you must teach this law to your children at your dining room table. So you've got to know it yourself. And they had it written down. So reading became important. It's not an accident that Jewish success in the world and being the first to read for non-practical reasons at first sight is related. So we lost that with our obsession with the goods that we could get out of science and then applied science. We become thing-orientated. Have you got a swimming pool? How many cars do you have? How good is the car? How big's your house? I was appalled when we came here and found that houses were measured in area they covered. That was a thought I'd never had. The question that I had growing up in two rooms up and 2 rooms down, plus a little box room at the top and a bathroom, and a toilet was actually outside. We just had function at that level. Now it's how many square feet you have. What a bizarre way to think about a house. So you end up with little boxes that look ugly from the outside. You go to Europe, where only the best architecture, as judged by people's love of it, is found in villages that didn't think in that way. I mean, take a very successful series like Midsummer Murders. I mean, half the fascination of those is that they cleverly set it in the Gloucestershire area of the country, the Cotswolds. I mean, exquisitely beautiful places. So they've got lovely scenery, but those villages had character that dated back centuries. So before we had the scourge of the motor car, everything had to be within walking distance. So the centre of the village was the village green, where cattle could graze. It was held in common, called a common in many cases, a pub, a church, and the basic shops you needed. And the houses tended to have small, well-tended gardens because they didn't want to have to walk too far to get to the centre of the village. And that produced a certain sort of architecture. The only places where you really see that in America is some of the New England villages, which have that same characteristic. Because, of course, when you actually got started in the 1770s, there was no motor car to stretch you out all over the place, and no railways either. So community meant that you lived together, and therefore you knew about one another, and you learned how to negotiate the difficulties of people living together for a long time. You knew who was miserable and who was kind and who did what and how well they did it, etc., etc. These are judgment calls all along the way. They're not anything that can be derived from science as such. So when we come to what can I know, we can certainly know certain things at a level that's reliable. We could discover the laws of nature. We don't always get it completely right. Newton's laws were good for terrestrial purposes, but you couldn't send your spacecraft out discovering the wonders of space using Newton's laws. You need more sophisticated versions that Einstein brought along. So we did get to understand, and then we thought we understood more than we did, because, of course, as Lewis points out beautifully in an essay in God in the Dock, laws don't do anything. They describe how things operate once some doing has happened. That's worth thinking about too. The essay I'm thinking of, I can't remember the title, but it begins with one of Lewis's colleagues pitying a woman for her ignorance, who was sure that her son had survived the disaster of the Arnhem episode at the end of the Second World War because she prayed so seriously for him. And Lewis's colleague sneered at her naivete. But Lewis thought about it and then realized that science doesn't actually do things. It describes what happens when things happen, why things happen as they do once something has happened to start it. In the beginning, what is an important question. So there were all sorts of variables in why somebody doesn't get shot when bullets are moving around, being shot. It's not the laws of science that are broken. When it's shot, it's going to go in a certain direction, but it's pushed by wind. There are variances in manufacture. The people on the other end of the line of fire may happen to move one way or another because they trip over or whatever. There are all sorts of variables going on. And Lewis is beginning to realize at that point just how dangerous scientism is. When you think you understand more than you do, yeah, the laws of science are good. And they can enable you to build, they can enable you to build airplanes and skyscrapers and the like. If you get the physics right, they stand up until some huge thing happens that can cause them to fall down, like a bomb or an earthquake. It wasn't the science that changed. It was a disruption around them that caused the change. And our lives are like that. And I think we all have moments when it really does look as though something interfered in our lives for our benefit in a way that science can't explain. I often use the example of my daughter in Africa driving some distance from their home base in a bit of Malawi they didn't know, going to a conference at the other end of Malawi, which is a long, thin country. And they go into a village. They're driving a Pinska, which is a European military vehicle. There's only 3 of them in Malawi. They're all owned by my son-in-law and daughter. Nobody will steal them, of course, because you couldn't hide them. But they are military vehicles. And they came into a village and a child ran straight in front of them. And he was a good driver. He managed not to run him over, but he inevitably hit him, knocked him down. He got out and thought he would be dead, but he wasn't. He was breathing. Meanwhile, Joanna was in shock with children in the back, some of them the same age or close to the age of the child who had just been knocked down. And up to her window comes an African, and all she remembers about him is he had a very striking white shirt. And now, of course, the story who heard what when between David and Joanna is somewhat now disputed. That's what happens. But this African said, tell your husband to get the child into the car and the parents. And he gave instructions as to how to get to a German mission hospital they didn't know about. Very lucid instructions. They got there, and the doctor said, well, given the story you have to tell, and when they looked at the vehicle, there was a dent where his head had hit the fender. And he said he's going to get swelling of his brain, and that will cause convulsions and coning and death. We're too far from neurosurgery to get him there in time. But it's better that he die here rather than in a Muslim village where there would probably have been a lot of fuss. So there were just some Muslim parents and Joanna and David and the doctor. And David's very charismatic end of the spectrum. And he said, well, can we pray for him and anoint him with oil? Well, and the doctor said they won't do any harm. It's not exactly culturally sensitive, is it, with two Muslim parents sitting there? But they did it. I think the Muslim parents knew that these two cared about their child, and this is part of caring. It wasn't doing any harm. They watched. But he didn't die. He woke up the next day, and eventually he came to the school that Joanna and David run on their base in southern Malawi. And the whole village converted from Islam to Christianity because of that phenomenon. And of course, when Joanna and David went looking for the African with the white shirt, no one had seen him. Now, I don't have any scientific explanation of that, but I don't need one, do I? And we all have experiences where something beyond ourselves appears to be operative. And of course, now the scientists, particularly in quantum physics and cosmology and molecular biology, are experiencing this wow factor firsthand. The fact that DNA is a message and the probability of this incredible message working the way it does is so vanishingly small. It's effectively past the point at which the mathematicians say there is zero probability of this happening by chance. The same is true. The Big Bang is unlikely to be just an accident, is it? Even people like, got name block, erstwhile head of the British Humanist Society, Penrose, says God is a real possibility. Certainly, God is as much a possible ultimate explanation as chance. Chance has got to operate on something. So you've got to deal with the question in the beginning, what, which they avoided for so long. I mean, Darwin's Origin of Species begins with talking about pigeons and the change that could happen with them. But that was all done by the intervention of pigeon breeders' intelligence. So, what can we know? Once we've learned things like the laws of physics, we can teach them in different ways. We can teach them by rote, which is what we tend to do. Or better teachers tend to get people to think about how that came to be and what we can learn about how we should think from analysis of what happened to Newton and what happened to others along the way. That's a much better form of education, I think. But we have gone for rote for two reasons, I think. One, it means that people who actually know nothing about a subject can pontificate on how it should be evaluated. That is terrible, but that's what the Faculty of Education has done. They believe that how you educate is scientific. Now, there may be some laws, but there's no science of education in the way that they would like to believe there is. I got out of bed for 20 years for one protein. The guy in the next lab, so to speak, got out for another. I wouldn't have got out of bed for his protein, and he wouldn't get out of bed for mine. The first time I came across it, I was fascinated, and it provided me as a researcher with a very interesting life, including 7 years in Jamaica because of that protein. Well, because of a lot more as well, of course. But why that fascinated me, I could have been fascinated by a myriad of other things. But human interest in things leading to real discovery is fascinating. And it isn't changed by the educational system. It's worth looking for the outliers every time or the contradictory data. The beginning of the modern in Paul Johnson's book, just a few years at the beginning of the 19th century, the 1800s, all sorts of things happened in Britain, were invented, were developed in some cases by people who were still functionally illiterate. And Faraday wasn't very good at mathematics, but he was fascinated by the natural world. These people changed our world. They were more deprived of education than the average person subjected to what's called education in the Western world even. Rote memorization, memorize and dump. Learn these things by heart, write them down to show you've learned them by heart, and then you can forget them, which is what most people do. George Stephenson built the first commercial steam engine before he could read or write. Being deprived of those things is not the reason why you're not developing. The reason you're not developing is back to those 10 commandments. If you wish to flourish, you must have structure. And at the heart of that structure, amazingly, is the family and the father's role in educating the family. His wife would easily do it, but her job is much more difficult. A woman is supposed to civilize men, and when she does, her life gets better too. And one of the civilizations is making him do his duty, which is to teach the stories of the Bible to his children before they can read and write. One of my grandsons sent me an email last week. He's getting near to the point where he will have read the whole Bible to his firstborn child before she's not even 5 yet. And he says, what next? I haven't replied yet because it's keep going because you're going to have other children. They take it all in. The interesting bit for him over the next few years is he can have the fun of inserting an error into the story he's teaching to the next generation, and the one will say, no. They want the story and they want it right. I remember many years ago being taken out to dinner by a couple who'd been influenced by this idea, and he was a doctor, she was a lawyer, and they just had their first child when they heard me talk about Jewish fathering. And he decided to do it. So he changed his practice so that he left at 4:30 every day, went home, had supper with his family, read to his children, and then came back and did his paperwork late at night because he wasn't far away. He said, I'm much more efficient than I was before. But he said, watch this. And the little girl was at the table with us, and she was 5 or 6. And he said to her, what was the name of Moses' sister? Was it Marjorie? And the little girl said, Daddy, you know it's Miriam. She's 6, 5 or 6. She knows the characters of the Bible down to the level of Miriam. And she knows what Miriam did and what happened to her. She has learned moral consequence in a way that will come back to her for the rest of her life. We try all the while to say that moral consequence doesn't exist, so it's not their fault. Yeah, they know it's their fault. That doesn't mean we all have equal opportunities, but you don't help people by saying, oh, poor thing. They know when they're doing wrong. Much of the world lived without a legal system and police and prisons because they had social community norms which had come down and formed over time, they know not from whence. I loved watching when a village had a problem that they needed to sort out in terms of, I don't know, it could be anything, distribution of land, how you use the water, etc., etc. It doesn't much matter what it was. But they would get together, and the chief had to, in effect, listen to everybody's point of view. And then he had to decide what the solution was going to be. That's amazing to watch. They could talk for a couple of days. That's the way they solved these problems. Presumably, we did much the same. Common law, which was the first and most amazing step forward in this direction, which came from King Alfred and his sons, he sent judges around England because England was too big to visit in the days when there was only tracts in many places. So he sent judges to different parts of the country to hear the difficult cases that they hadn't been able to deal with locally. And he said, first get them to say what options they think are reasonable in their society. And then make them think through the process so that they can come to decisions with which they feel socially comfortable, and they can see that they're setting a precedent. They're not writing the law, they're setting a precedent. So it may be that the normal thing to do with a thief is such and such, but in this situation, he was so desperate, etc., etc. We think the shame that he feels over being a thief, even though he did it for good reason, is more than enough punishment. And you set a precedent. So common law is incredibly flexible over time. It doesn't change the law. The law is still what the courts say it is and what the government says that it is, or going that far back, what the Bible said it was. But then it has to be applied to the situation. In those misogynistic days, it was 12 good men and true would sit in judgment, and nowadays it's good men and women, and that's fine. A wonderful invention. And it's not surprising that the countries that inherited from England common law, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, are doing well. Because without that basis, you cannot flourish. That's what was said. Israel is in that group too, of course. So what we can know is not totally described by science. To believe that it is scientism. To say that the science is in, and therefore we know what to do about COVID, has totally neglected the human dimension. There's no humanity in it. And it didn't work. It was a disaster. And those kids who were just beginning school in those 2 years, they could sue the government, I think. I don't know how it worked, but they're going to need a lot more help than everyone else, and on grounds of justice. Now, where do we get our oughts from? That's the next thing. What we like is to have little lists so that we don't have to think too much. And that's the way our education works to a large degree now. Certainly doing medicine, having a superb memory is an incredible gift in that context, because you learn medicine from patients and not from textbooks. The patient takes you to the textbook, and you can usually find the patient that did it if the textbook makes a real impact. There are exceptions, of course, but in general, you see something and you say, seen this before. Who does it in? And it all falls into place. Basically, what's happening when a physician, say in internal medicine, dealing with people who have a serious disease and nobody's quite sure what it is, as you take the history, as you talk up to the patient about what's going on, you're constantly, without really thinking about it, proposing to yourself a series of hypotheses. And then you say, if that's true, it's not, so that one's gone. And you're looking at ways to throw out the various hypotheses until eventually you end up with the one that's the right answer in most cases. But it can take a while. One of the best clinical teachers I had was an ID physician, Harold Lambert. We'd get people coming in from London Airport from all over the world who were sick, and he would worry about it, keep going back. He said, just go back and talk to them again. And that recurrent talking to them as persons can be so important. Sometimes it's quite funny. I remember the Prophet medicine who taught me a lot, the superb mind. There was a strange pneumonia, and he just knew that it was strange at that point. And we went through the history, etc. And he said, does anyone have anything to say? And a little nurse just blurted out, oh, her parrot died. She's so sad. She'd talked to the woman, of course, or Bajrigar or parrot, I can't remember which it was now. But of course, that was the solution. you put it into the humane situation and psittacosis came out. They would have got there anyway because you go through rare pneumonias and it's there in the list. But this one came out because of a human comment. And that's so often the case. So that form of knowledge, we call it empathy, as though it's something that we can practice with the greatest of ease, which of course, empathy is not like that, is it? We have idiots trying to teach us how to do this, and honesty is the thing that you can do. I remember saying to a patient whose husband had died the night before while she was in hospital, and I said, I don't know what to say to you. I can't imagine what you're feeling. Not much of a doctor, am I? And she said, you're the best one who've come today. You're the first one who showed any sign of understanding what I'm going through. And she gave me a kiss, actually. Now that was just honesty, nothing else, and not wanting to be dishonest. So simply telling the truth about not knowing what to say. Now, of course, the people who think they know about these things want to evaluate us on knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Well, knowledge is scientism as far as they're concerned. And you do need to know the science as far as it goes. It's very important. I love it. Especially physiology and medicine and pathophysiology. Skills, yeah. Diminishing, of course, now, because now machines provide the skills better than we used to have to manage with our ears, our eyes, our hands. But there's a danger in that. That's perhaps a talk for another time, because I see that the time is evaporating. I don't know quite why. And attitudes, that's bizarre, ridiculous. A method actor like Meryl Streep can display attitudes that will make you think she's a saint one day and a whore the next. Any actor could ace the attitudes aspect of that phenomenon, but it's not real. It's acting. No. We all know, after a few years working with colleagues, who's the best doctor at this or that subject. We also know who's got the most remarkable talents with patients. They all love him. Harold Lambert was loved by his patients because he cared about them. I remember on another occasion, I'd been on the night before and admitted a woman, and I knew roughly what was going on, but I knew I was missing something. And I said, Harold, she's not telling me the whole story. And I've tried. He sat down on the bed, talked to her, and in a few minutes, the whole thing came out. People immediately warmed to him. He was a lovely man. I'm not. I'm far too prickly in many ways. Some patients see that and they compensate for it and they forgive me. That's great. But he had that natural touch. Wendell Berry hammers the Faculty of Education when he describes Miss Minnie as someone who went to learn the techniques of education in the college. But when she came back, she didn't use any of them because, why? She loved children and she loved books, and she taught by merely introducing the one to the other. Two loves. The heart of real teaching is two loves. You must love the subject and you must love the recipient, the student, the member of the congregation. They see that. They know that. We all know it. This last Sunday, I was a bit down, wondering, okay, how does your life end in the end, etc., etc. Being a bit, stupid. But the whole service was directed at me as far as I was concerned. Of course, the reading was Elijah feeling exactly like that. And God says, what's the matter with you? Gives him a shake and gets him going again. It was beautifully told as a story by our pastor. priest, as they call him. It's an Anglican church. I'm still struggling with that bit to a degree. But I love the liturgy. I love that opening. Unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, from whom no secrets are hid. That's our God. So don't play games. He knows everything. He knows your next most important need, if you will, but listen carefully. So the lists don't work. When it comes to what should I do, ethics, we started teaching ethics in the 80s in most places. All that it's really done, from my point of view, is keep some otherwise unemployable philosophers off the streets, because what's being taught doesn't make you ethical. Again, it's reduced to a list. You must look at the autonomy of the patient. You must look for justice. You must do good and you must not do evil. No discussion of how those ideas come together. No discussion of how they are held together in literature. Which one's more important, which one's less important. I'll leave you to think about those things, because then you can write to me if you want me to do more. Might force you to do that. A few of you do, but it's what keeps me going. I'd gladly stop, especially if you write and say, you've done enough, you wander around too much. But a lot of people like the rabbit holes where I go off and then come back again later, sometimes a week or two later. So we've been going for almost an hour, so I was going to get on with talking about reading, but that will have to wait till next week. But in the interval, this summer edition of First Things has a wonderful piece called The Future of Reading by Wesley Dutoit. Read it. You will enjoy next week much more if you do. Meanwhile, what about reading a bit more? I was astonished this week talking to a group of men that they had difficulty in thinking of any book they'd read in completion for quite a long while. And in fact, most of us are forgetting how to read in the real sense of the word. And we'll talk about that next week. The Lord be with you all.